Hello. It's funny how a simple phrase can dig into your mind. Refusing to leave. Emily, my wife, had started using it more often. Working late. It wasn't a new concept, of course. Her job at the marketing firm often required late hours, but lately, those late nights had multiplied, and each time she said it, it felt rehearsed, like an actor repeating the same line over and over until the meaning vanished. I tried to brush it off at first. Relationships aren't perfect, and work stress was a real thing. But something changed, like a wrong note in a familiar song. She was different, distracted, her smiles less genuine, her touch less frequent. One Friday evening, she said she'd be working late again, her eyes avoiding mine as she slipped out of the door. This time it didn't sit right. I was tired of ignoring the whispers in my head, tired of pretending everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. So I decided to follow her. The rain was relentless that night, hammering on the roof and streaming down the windshield as I sat in my car across the street. I watched as Emily left the house, her coat pulled tight against the downpour. I waited a few minutes before starting my car, keeping my headlights off until she was far enough ahead. She always said she was going to the office downtown, but instead of turning left at the intersection, she turned right. My heart pounded as I followed at a distance, making sure to keep other cars between us. This wasn't the route to her office. She was heading in the opposite direction, toward the edge of the city, the kind of place where streetlights were few and far between, where the shadows were deeper and secrets were easier to keep. The further we drove, the tighter my grip on the wheel became. I didn't want to believe it, but there she was, driving deeper into the night. Emily eventually pulled into the parking lot of a small restaurant. One of those places with no name on the sign, just a neon light advertising, open. I parked a safe distance away, switching off my engine, my breath misting in the cold car. She stepped out of her vehicle, her face partially hidden under her hood. I watched as she scanned the parking lot, as if checking for someone. Moments later, a man walked up to her. He was tall, with a confident stride and an easy smile. I could see the way her face lit up when she saw him, something I hadn't seen in a long time. My stomach twisted as I watched them. The man leaned in, and she met him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that lasted far too long. A part of me wanted to burst out of the car, to demand answers, to confront them both. But another part of me, the part that had spent years learning how to read people, how to gather evidence, knew better. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what this was, how long it had been going on, why she had chosen him over me. They walked into the restaurant together, her arm wrapped around his, like they'd done it 1,000 times before. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, the rain masking the tears that burned at the corners of my eyes. I was a detective, and here I was, my own wife deceiving me right under my nose. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't let it break me. I needed to stay focused. I needed proof that this wasn't just some mistake, that it wasn't something that could be explained away. I grabbed my camera from the glove compartment, an old habit from years of tailing suspects. I stepped out of the car, staying in the shadows as I approached the restaurant. The windows were fogged, but I found a spot where I could see inside. They were seated at a booth, her hand resting on his, her face animated as they talked. She was smiling, the kind of smile I hadn't seen in months. It was like watching someone I didn't know, someone who had replaced the woman I loved. I snapped a few photos, each click of the shutter feeling like a nail in the coffin of our marriage. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I needed to see it, needed to face the reality of what was happening. This was no late night at the office. This was something far worse. A life she'd built without me. A secret she'd kept hidden while I sat at home, trusting her, loving her. The rain continued to fall, the cold seeping into my bones as I watched them laugh, as I watched her lean into him, her head resting on his shoulder. I'd seen enough. I turned away, the weight of what I'd discovered pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. This was just the beginning. I knew that now. There was more to the story, more that I needed to uncover, and I wasn't going to stop until I knew everything. I slipped back into my car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The drive home was a blur, the rain and the tears blending together, the city lights passing by in a haze. I had followed her to find the truth, and now that I had it, I wasn't sure what to do with it. But one thing was clear: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning felt like waking up in a different world. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Emily's soft breathing beside me, her face turned away. I couldn't help but wonder if she had any idea. Did she know that I'd followed her? That I'd seen everything? The thought twisted my gut, filling me with a mix of anger and sadness. I wanted to shake her awake, to demand answers, to hear her admit what she had done. But that would be too easy, too direct, and I wasn't ready for her lies just yet. Instead, I played my part. I got up, showered, made us both coffee, and acted as though everything was fine. She came downstairs, her smile still soft, still familiar. But to me it felt fake now, an echo of something real, something that had been lost. She kissed me on the cheek, and I forced myself to smile back, to pretend that I didn't know. Her betrayal was our new secret, and for now I intended to keep it that way. As she left for work, I decided to dig deeper. I had names, faces, and places, but what I needed were details. I needed to know how long this had been going on, how many lies she had told me, how deep this rabbit hole went. My training had taught me to be thorough, methodical. If Emily had built herself a double life, I was going to tear it apart piece by piece. I started with her phone. It wasn't easy. Emily was cautious, careful. But no one is perfect. I had picked up her passcode months ago, not because I didn't trust her then, but because old habits die hard, and trust in my line of work was always measured against caution. She left her phone charging in the kitchen while she showered, and I took my chance. My fingers moved quickly, scrolling through her messages. Most of it was innocuous work emails, group chats with her friends. But then I found him, Greg, the name that made my chest tighten, my hands clench. The same man I had seen her with at the restaurant. Their messages were brief, but telling. They had a rhythm, a casual intimacy that made my skin crawl. There were no explicit confessions, no incriminating photos, but there were plans to meet, to slip away to places I'd never known about. Reading their exchanges, I could feel the life I thought I had with Emily slipping further and further away. I took a deep breath, careful not to make a sound as I heard the water shut off upstairs. I needed to be quick. I took screenshots of their conversations, forwarding them to my own phone before deleting any trace of my intrusion. I set her phone back exactly where it had been and returned to my coffee, my heart pounding in my chest. When she came downstairs, she gave me that same soft smile, and I forced myself to give one back, my stomach churning with the weight of what I knew. The next few days were a blur of deceit. Emily's, mine, the lies we told each other to keep the illusion of our marriage intact. She worked late again, and this time, I let her go without a word, watching her leave while I sat at the kitchen table. The photos and messages burned into my memory. I waited until she was gone, then grabbed my camera and followed. This time, she didn't go to the nameless restaurant. She drove across town, her headlights cutting through the darkness as I trailed her from a safe distance. She parked in front of an apartment building, a place I didn't recognize, but it was clear she did. She stepped out of the car, her body language relaxed, familiar. She didn't even check her surroundings before walking through the gate and disappearing into the building. It was like she had done it 1,000 times before. I parked a block away, slipping into the shadows as I approached on foot. The rain had stopped, but the chill remained, the cold air biting at my skin. I watched from the corner of the street, my eyes following her silhouette as she disappeared into one of the apartments on the second floor. The curtains were drawn, but I could see movement behind the fabric, the faint glow of a lamp illuminating two figures. It was her and it was him. They were close, their bodies moving together, and I could feel my heart shattering with every second that passed. I snapped a few more photos, my camera clicking softly in the silence. It was proof, but it felt like a knife twisting deeper into the wound. I had seen enough, but I couldn't move, my feet rooted to the pavement as I watched them. They laughed, they touched, and I could see Emily's face, her expression so carefree, so different from the woman she was with me. It was like watching someone else entirely, a stranger wearing my wife's face. I finally turned away, my chest heavy with the weight of betrayal. I walked back to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I started the engine, the low rumble breaking the silence of the street. I needed to go home, to clear my head, to figure out what came next. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. Back home, the silence of the house was deafening. I sat in the dark, the photos and messages on my phone like ghosts haunting me. I scrolled through them, each image a reminder of the life she had built without me, a life she had chosen over ours. I needed a plan. I couldn't confront her yet. Not without understanding why, not without knowing everything. There had to be more to this, something that made sense of the senseless betrayal. I thought about the times she'd said she was working late, the moments that had seemed off but that I had ignored. The signs had been there, and I had been blind to them, too caught up in my own life to see the cracks forming in ours. Now those cracks had become a chasm, and I was standing at the edge, staring into the void. This wasn't just about Emily and her lover. This was about the life we had built together, the future we had planned. I needed to know if it was all a lie, or if there was something worth saving. And to do that, I had to keep digging, keep following the trail she had left behind. I was a detective, after all, and this was the case of my life. The days that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. I lived with Emily like nothing had changed, waking up next to her, sharing meals, smiling through the mundane conversations of daily life, all while knowing about her secret. My mind was a constant battlefield between anger and heartbreak, each passing moment feeding the fire of betrayal burning inside me. I knew I couldn't confront her just yet, not until I knew the full truth. I spent my evenings piecing together the fragments of information I had, building a timeline of her lies. Each time she had worked late, each unexplained absence, every inconsistency that I'd brushed off as innocent. All of it started to form a pattern. Her relationship with Greg hadn't just begun recently. It had been months in the making. Each discovery was another blow, a reminder of how far she had drifted from me without my even noticing. During the day, I decided to dig into Greg's background. I used resources I hadn't touched in years, old contacts, favors that were still owed, databases I could access only because of my years as a private investigator. It didn't take long to find him. Gregory Dalton, age 35, a mid-level manager at some tech company across town. He had no criminal record, nothing particularly remarkable. A normal guy living a normal life, the kind of man Emily might have met at a networking event or a conference. That realization only made things worse. I needed to know more about their meetings, more about why she was willing to risk everything we had for him. So, one evening after Emily left for work, I followed her again, keeping my distance as she drove to his apartment. I parked nearby and waited, watching as she disappeared inside. The thought of them together, sharing intimate moments that had once been mine, made my stomach churn. This time, I wasn't content just watching from the outside. I needed to hear them, to know what they talked about behind those closed doors. I slipped out of my car and made my way closer, the shadows of the building hiding me as I approached. I could hear muffled laughter through the walls, their voices blending together, carefree. My heart twisted in my chest, each laugh a knife that twisted the wound deeper. I found a spot near a window that was open just a crack, enough for me to hear their voices. They were sitting on the couch, talking. She sounded happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't heard in so long. It was like she had shed the weight she carried when she was with me, and that realization hurt more than anything. I listened as they talked about plans, about places they wanted to go, things they wanted to do. They spoke of a future together, a future that didn't include me. It was like hearing my own eulogy, knowing I had been replaced. Greg's voice was low, steady. He was talking about how much he wanted her, about how he was tired of sneaking around. He wanted her to leave me. I clenched my teeth, my fists trembling at my sides. Emily didn't say anything at first, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she finally spoke. She talked about me, about how it was complicated, how she wasn't sure if she was ready to end it yet. But she didn't deny that she wanted to be with him. She didn't deny that she had feelings for him. The cold reality settled in my chest. She was weighing her options. She was trying to decide if I was worth holding on to or if she should cut ties and move on with Greg. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my ears. I'd heard enough. The truth was staring me in the face, and it was uglier than I had imagined. Emily was torn between two lives, and I was just a part of the past she hadn't figured out how to let go of yet. I returned to my car, my body numb, my mind racing. This wasn't just about an affair. This was about my entire life being rewritten, about everything I thought I knew being turned upside down. I needed to take control, to decide what happened next before she could. I wasn't going to sit back and wait for her to make her choice. This was my life, and I wasn't going to let her take it from me without a fight. The next day, I took the first step. I called an old friend, Mike, a lawyer I had worked with years ago on a messy divorce case. He owed me a favor, and I intended to cash it in. We met for coffee, and I explained the situation in as few words as possible. I didn't want sympathy. I just wanted a plan. Mike listened, nodding, his expression a mix of concern and focus. He knew what was at stake, and he didn't ask questions. He just promised to help me, to make sure I was protected. He suggested I gather financial documents, bank statements, anything that would show where our assets stood. If Emily was considering leaving, I needed to be prepared. I needed to know what she might try to take, what leverage I had if things went south. It felt cold, calculating, but that was the reality of what I was facing. This wasn't just about love anymore, it was about survival. That evening, I returned home, my mind still reeling from everything I had heard and everything I needed to do. Emily was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, her face lighting up when she saw me walk through the door. For a moment, I almost believed the facade, almost believed that we were just another couple, happy and content. But I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I couldn't unhear the things she had said to Greg. She asked me how my day was, her voice warm, genuine. I forced a smile, telling her it was fine. I watched her move around the kitchen, her movements graceful, familiar. She was still my wife, still the woman I had loved for years. But there was a distance between us now, a chasm that couldn't be crossed. I had seen the truth of who she was, and there was no going back. As we sat down to eat, I tried to keep the conversation light, casual. I needed her to believe that I didn't know, that I was still oblivious to the double life she was leading. I asked her about work, about her day, pretending to be interested in the mundane details of her life. She played her part well, smiling, laughing, answering my questions without a hint of hesitation. It was almost impressive how easily she lied, how effortlessly she kept up the charade. But I knew better now. I knew that every word she spoke was a lie, that every smile she gave me was false. And as much as it hurt, it also steeled my resolve. I was done being the fool, done being the one left in the dark while she made decisions about our future without me. I was going to take back control, to make sure that, when the dust settled, I wasn't the one left with nothing. This was just the beginning. The next steps were already forming in my mind, the pieces falling into place. I wasn't going to let her decide my fate. I was going to expose her, to make sure that everyone saw the truth of who she was. She had built herself a double life, and I was going to tear it apart, brick by brick. The days that followed were a delicate dance of deception. Emily continued her routine, completely unaware that I was now a spectator, scrutinizing every step she took, every word she spoke. She still left for work late into the night, her lies as smooth as ever. I let her believe she had me fooled, that her perfect facade remained intact, all the while gathering every bit of evidence I could to expose her. I began recording her phone calls, her messages, and the few times she had long, hushed conversations with Greg in our own home. The irony wasn't lost on me. This house, this life, everything we had built together, now served as the very stage for her betrayal. I set up a few hidden cameras in the house, small enough not to catch her eye. They recorded everything while I was at work. Every time she smiled at a text, every lie she rehearsed before calling me. Watching those recordings later made me feel like I was dissecting a stranger's life. The person Emily had become was so far from the woman I thought I knew. The hardest part was pretending, keeping up the act of a clueless husband while I watched my marriage crumble piece by piece. Emily's laughter, her smile, all the little things I had loved about her, had become twisted. They were no longer genuine, just masks she wore to keep me in the dark. The realization hurt more than anything, but it also fueled me. I was determined to get to the bottom of this, to find the truth and decide what came next. I knew I had to confront Greg. It wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about the man who had decided he could walk into my life and steal what was mine. I tracked him down easily enough. He worked in a bland office building downtown. I watched him from my car during lunch breaks, studying his routine. He was every bit the ordinary man, unassuming, unremarkable. I couldn't understand what Emily saw in him, what had drawn her away from everything we had together. It was late one evening, after I had watched Emily disappear into his apartment again, that I decided to make my move. I waited until I saw her car parked outside Greg's building, until I knew they were inside, comfortable in their secret. I walked up to the door, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and adrenaline. I could hear laughter coming from inside, muffled by the walls, but it was enough to make my blood boil. I raised my fist and knocked, the sound echoing through the hallway. It took a few moments before the door opened. Greg stood there, his eyes widening in surprise. He recognized me instantly. The look of shock on his face told me that much. For a split second, he hesitated, as if considering whether to slam the door in my face. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I pushed past him, stepping inside before he could react. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished. Emily stood in the living room, her face going pale the moment she saw me. For a moment, we all just stood there, the silence thick with tension. Emily's eyes darted between me and Greg, her mouth opening and closing, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Surprised to see me?" I finally said, my voice calm, though my insides felt like they were on fire. "James, Emily started, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Save it, Emily. I'm not here for an explanation," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "I've heard enough, seen enough. I know exactly what's going on." Greg looked like he wanted to disappear. He shifted nervously, his eyes avoiding mine. I turned to him, my voice steady but cold. "You think you can just walk into someone's life and take whatever you want? You think there are no consequences?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, his face a mix of fear and confusion. I could see the doubt in his eyes now, the realization that he'd bitten off more than he could chew. Emily stepped forward, her eyes pleading, but I ignored her. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about him and the arrogance it took to think he could have my life. I took a step closer to Greg, my voice lowering. "You need to understand something. This isn't just about you and her. You walked into my life, my home. You didn't think about what that would mean, what it would do. You just wanted what you wanted, and now you're going to deal with the consequences." Emily grabbed my arm, her voice desperate. "James, please, let's just talk about this." I shook her off, my eyes still on Greg. "No, Emily, there's nothing left to talk about. You made your choice." I turned to leave, my heart heavy, but my resolve unbroken. I had seen enough. The truth was out in the open now, and there was no turning back. As I walked out of the apartment, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The confrontation hadn't gone exactly as I'd imagined, but it had given me clarity. Emily and Greg were both cowards, people who hid behind lies and secrecy, unwilling to face the reality of their actions. I was done playing their game. It was time to take control, to decide my own fate. The next morning, I met with Mike again. I laid everything out for him, the evidence, the recordings, the confrontation. He listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "You've got enough to make this a very difficult situation for her, James," he said, his voice measured. "But you need to think about what you want. Do you want to drag this out, make it public, make it ugly? Or do you just want to walk away and start over?" I didn't have an answer for him. Not yet. Part of me wanted to burn it all down, to make sure that Emily and Greg paid for what they had done. But another part of me just wanted to be free, to leave the lies and the betrayal behind and start over. The weight of the decision pressed down on me, and I knew it wasn't something I could decide overnight. For now, I was content knowing that the truth was out. Emily knew that I knew, and there was no hiding from it anymore. She had made her choices, and now she would have to face the consequences. I wasn't going to let her dictate my life any longer. I was taking back control, and whatever came next, I was ready for it. That evening, I returned home to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of fear and regret. I stood in the doorway, my heart heavy, but my resolve unbroken. "James, please," she started, her voice breaking. "We need to talk. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." I stared at her, the woman I had loved for so long, the woman who had betrayed me in ways I never thought possible. Her apologies felt hollow, her regret too little, too late. I took a deep breath, my voice steady as I spoke. "There's nothing left to say, Emily. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." I turned and walked away, her sobs echoing behind me as I made my way to the bedroom. The door closed with a soft click, cutting off the sound of her crying. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the weight of everything finally settling over me. The road ahead was uncertain, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. I was ready to face whatever came next on my own terms. The days that followed were a blur of quiet tension. Emily tried to talk to me, her voice strained, her eyes filled with tears that no longer moved me. Each time she opened her mouth to beg for forgiveness, I shut her down. I had nothing left to say, and I certainly wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. I had heard enough lies, seen enough deceit. The woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. The hardest part wasn't watching her cry or listening to her desperate pleas. It was letting go of the future I had imagined for us. The plans we had made, the dreams we had shared, it was all gone now. In its place was a cold, empty space, a void where my life with her had once been. But as painful as it was, I knew it was necessary. Holding on to something that no longer existed would only destroy me. I continued gathering evidence, determined to make sure that when it came time to end things, I would be the one in control. I documented everything. Texts, calls, the time she slipped out of the house to see Greg. Each piece of evidence was a reminder of her betrayal, a testament to the lies she had built her life upon. It hurt, but it also gave me strength. I wasn't going to be the victim anymore. I was going to be the one who decided how this ended. One evening, I found Emily sitting in the living room, her face buried in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her eyes swollen from crying. For a moment, I almost felt a pang of sympathy, a flicker of the love I once had for her. But then I remembered the nights she had spent in Greg's arms, the laughter they had shared while I was at home, clueless. The sympathy vanished, replaced by a cold resolve. "James," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please just talk to me. Let me explain." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "What's there to explain, Emily? I know everything. I know about Greg. I know about the nights you said you were working late, the lies you told me over and over again." Tears spilled down her cheeks, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You made a choice, Emily. You chose to lie, to betray me. You don't accidentally end up in someone else's bed. This wasn't a mistake. It was a decision you made, over and over again." She stood up, her hands trembling. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But we can fix this, James. We can work through it. I still love you." The words hung in the air, empty and meaningless. I stared at her, the woman I had once planned to spend my life with, and all I felt was emptiness. The love she claimed to still have for me was nothing compared to the damage she had done. She had shattered everything we had, and there was no putting it back together. "Love," I said, my voice cold. You think you still love me after everything you've done? You don't destroy the person you love, Emily. You don't tear them apart and expect them to just forgive you. She reached out, her fingers brushing against my arm. I pulled away, her touch like ice against my skin. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice breaking for the first time. I can't keep pretending that everything will be okay. You made your choice and now I'm making mine. This is over, Emily. Her face crumpled, her sobs echoing in the empty room as I turned and walked away. I made my way to the spare bedroom, the one I had been sleeping in since the confrontation at Greg's apartment. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as the weight of everything crashed down on me. The finality of my words, the realization that this was truly the end. It was overwhelming. I sat down on the bed, my head in my hands. The woman I had loved, the future I had envisioned, was gone. All that was left was a hollow shell of what once was, and the cold, stark reality of what lay ahead. But even through the pain, there was a sense of relief. I was finally taking control, finally deciding my own fate. I was done being the one left behind, the one waiting for someone else to make the choice for me. The next morning, I began making arrangements to move out. I couldn't stay in that house any longer, surrounded by the ghosts of what used to be. I contacted Mike, asking him to start drawing up the papers. The divorce was inevitable now, and I wanted it over with as soon as possible. There was no point in dragging it out, no point in pretending there was anything left to salvage. Emily tried to talk to me, tried to convince me that we could work through it, but I refused to listen. I was done with the lies, done with the deception. Each time she begged for another chance, it only solidified my resolve. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, a place where I could start over, away from the memories of our life together. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a fresh start away from the pain and betrayal. Moving out was harder than I had expected. Each box I packed, each room I emptied, was a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. But it was also a step toward freedom, a step away from the lies that had consumed me. On my last night in the house, I stood in the empty living room, the walls bare, the furniture gone. Emily stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking as she spoke. "James, please, don't leave like this. We can fix it. I know we can." I turned to her, my heart heavy but resolute. "You had your chance, Emily. You had so many chances and you chose to throw them away. I'm done." I walked out the door, the cool night air hitting my face as I stepped outside. I didn't look back. Couldn't. This was the end, and looking back would only make it harder. I got into my car, the engine rumbling to life as I pulled away from the house that had once been my home. The road stretched out before me, uncertain but full of possibilities. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could find happiness again. Settling into my new apartment was a strange experience. The space was unfamiliar, the walls bare, and the quietness felt both liberating and unnerving. I had spent years sharing every aspect of my life with Emily, and now, for the first time, I found myself alone with nothing but my thoughts. There was no one to greet me when I came home, no laughter or voices echoing through the rooms. It was just me starting over from scratch. But in the emptiness, I found a sense of peace. Each day, the distance between me and my old life grew, and the weight of Emily's betrayal started to lift. The memories still hurt, and there were nights when the pain felt overwhelming, but I kept moving forward. I focused on my work, on rebuilding my life one day at a time. I leaned on Mike and a few trusted friends who knew what I was going through. Their support, their ability to listen without judgment, became the lifeline I needed to pull myself out of the darkness. Mike, always the realist, offered both advice and a shoulder to lean on, but never sugarcoated the situation. He was the one who reminded me, day after day, that I had done the right thing by walking away. "You deserve better," he'd say, his tone always firm, always unyielding. And though it took a while for me to fully believe it, those words started to resonate. I deserved better than the lies and deceit. I deserved a chance at happiness, real happiness, not the illusion that Emily had created. One afternoon, Mike called me with news that gave me a sense of closure. The divorce papers had been signed, the process finalized. It was officially over. I hung up the phone, taking a deep breath, letting the realization sink in. It was done, there was no going back now. I stood in my empty apartment, the paperwork in hand, and felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. The chapter of my life with Emily was closed, and it was time to start writing the next one. Despite everything, I didn't hate Emily. The anger had faded over time, replaced by a kind of detached sadness. What we had was gone, and there was no point in holding on to the bitterness. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. Our paths had diverged, and I hoped she found whatever it was she was searching for, just as I hoped I would find my own way forward. There was no point in clinging to the past. It was time to let it go. I started focusing on myself, on the things I had once loved but had neglected over the years. I picked up my old guitar, its strings rusty from disuse, and began playing again. The music filled the emptiness of the apartment, each note a reminder that there was still beauty in the world. I spent weekends hiking, losing myself in the solitude of nature, letting the quiet calm my restless mind. I even took up cooking, learning to make meals that were more than just sustenance. They became a new form of therapy, something I could control and create. Slowly, I began to rebuild. I found joy in the small things, in the freedom of making my own choices without having to worry about someone else's lies or deception. There were days when the loneliness was heavy, when the memories of what I had lost threatened to pull me under, but I fought against it. I wasn't going to let Emily's betrayal define me. I had a life to live, and I was determined to live it on my own terms. One day, as I sat on my small balcony, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink, I realized I was okay. The pain was still there, a dull ache that I knew might never fully go away, but it no longer consumed me. I had made it through the worst of it, and I had survived. I had lost so much, but I had also gained something invaluable. My freedom, my sense of self, my ability to move forward without the weight of someone else's lies dragging me down. I knew I would never forget Emily or the betrayal that had shattered my world. It was a part of my story, a chapter that had shaped who I was. But it wasn't the end. It was just a part of the journey, one that had taught me lessons about trust, love, and resilience. I was stronger now, wiser, and more determined than ever to build a life that was mine. One built on truth, on honesty, and on hope. Weeks turned into months, and gradually, the sting of the betrayal dulled. I threw myself into my work, taking on new projects that challenged me, that filled my days with purpose. The loneliness that had once felt suffocating slowly became something more manageable, something I learned to live with. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. One evening, I ran into an old friend at a bar, someone I hadn't seen since before everything had gone wrong. We talked, laughed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. We talked about the past, about old times, and for the first time I was able to talk about Emily without the bitterness, without the anger. It felt like a weight had been lifted, like I had finally let go of the last remnants of what had once been. As the night wore on, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was ready to let someone new into my life. I wasn't looking for anything serious, not yet, but I was open to the possibility. I had been broken, but I had put myself back together piece by piece. I had survived the worst, and I was still standing. And now I was ready to start living again, to start building a future that was truly mine. Months after moving into my new apartment, I finally decided to clear out the last of the boxes I had brought from the old house. They had been sitting in the corner, untouched, filled with the remnants of a life that no longer existed. As I went through them, I found old photographs. Pictures of Emily and me, smiling, happy, unaware of what lay ahead. I looked at them for a moment, then set them aside. Those memories were from a different time, from a different life. I wasn't that person anymore, and I didn't need to hold on to the ghosts of what had been. I gathered the photos, the mementos, and placed them in a box. I didn't need them to remember, and I certainly didn't need them to move forward. I took the box down to the dumpster, tossing it inside without a second thought. It was time to let go of the past, to leave behind the pain and betrayal and focus on what lay ahead. As I walked back to my apartment, the evening air cool against my skin, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I had made it through the storm, and now, for the first time in a long time, the horizon looked clear. I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to face it. I had learned to trust myself again, to find strength in my own resilience. Emily had been a part of my life, a part that had ended in heartbreak and betrayal. But she wasn't the end of my story. She was just a chapter, one that had taught me hard lessons but also shown me how strong I could be. I was ready to turn the page, to start writing the next part of my life. One filled with hope, with new possibilities, and, most importantly, with a sense of peace that came from knowing I was finally free. Bye-bye.